Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to be here tonight to discuss proportional representation. The focus of my submission tonight is going to be discussing or debunking the myths of proportional representation. I'm going to be making a case for mixed member proportional representation. Now, I have been a student of electoral reform for many, many years. I've studied various models. And when it comes to proportional representation, specifically mixed member proportions, I have read several detractors who have come up with 6 very common arguments on why it will not work. And on the surface, they seem to be very valid, but when you take a closer look, they are really not that valid at all. They're myths, and that's what I would like to do tonight. I'd like to debunk the 6 common myths that are associated with this model. The first myth is that MMP would lead to a system where party leaders, at their own discretion, would appoint regional lists of candidates and in the process ignore grassroots supporters of the party and even the voters' wishes. Well, in a number of countries that do use this system, that really isn't the case. What often happens is that in an electoral region, and we'll use, say, Toronto, for example, if Toronto were created an electoral region, a member of a political party, say the PC party, members residing in that electoral district could vote on and choose which candidates are going to go on that list. And that would ensure that the grassroots would have a say. Furthermore, if an open list system were used, and is in some countries, the voters would actually get a say as to which candidates on the specific party list they choose would be selected for regional seats. By using these 2 methods, this acts as a check and balance against arbitrary appointments by party leaders. A second common myth associated with MMP is that MMP, or proportional representation in general, would result in a fractious legislature and no party would be able to obtain a majority. Now, the detractors often focus on what I call the I-squared principle, Italy and Israel, because those 2 countries do use PR and they do often get fractious legislatures and there's a lot of turnover in the government. But when you look at European countries that use MMP, in Germany specifically, most of their provinces that use the MMP system do in fact get majority governments. And the reason for this is because they have been able to set a threshold at 5%, which I think makes a big difference. It's countries like Italy and Israel, for example, that have set the threshold at a low level at 3% or 2%. Once that happens, you start to get fringe parties, one-issue parties, and other individuals who get in, and that's what causes a fractious legislature. If you can set the threshold level at a high enough level, let's say at 5%, you would avoid such problems. The third myth is that coalitions governments would result in unstable governments and frequent turnover in elections. Again, it is true. I know a lot of detractors, again, focus on Italy and Israel, where I know in some cases it seems that they're switching governments every 2 weeks. But in Europe, what I have found in my studies was that often coalition governments will last the full mandate, which is usually 4 or 5 years. It's very unusual for a coalition government to collapse midway during a mandate. So, this is because in Europe, the parties have adapted to consensus-style politics. They're used to working together and forming coalition governments together, and consequently, they're able to form stable coalition governments. I'd also like to point out that coalition governments could actually be a positive thing, in that if you have a coalition government that goes on repeatedly from election through election, you won't have any serious lurches in policy from one government to the next. Also, if you have a coalition government that has 2 or more parties, you have a far greater chance of having legislation proposed that would have a support of the majority of the population. A fourth myth is that an MMP system would effectively prevent any candidates who want to run as independents from getting any seats in the legislature. This is patently false. First of all, under an MMP system, constituencies would still exist, and candidates who choose to run as independents are free to run and try to contest seats as independents. And they can also contest seats on a regional level as well. I'll use an example in Scotland, which uses an MMP system. They do have provisions for independents to stand as a regional candidate. They could submit themselves under their own name as a list, as a voting option, provided they meet the mandatory fees and get a certain number of electoral nominations from across the region that they're running in. In the most recent Scottish election, they did have a Scottish member of Parliament who quit or defected his party. He stood as an independent at the regional level and subsequently won. Now, that being the case, I really don't buy the argument that independents could not be elected as either a regional or constituency member under this system. The fifth myth: regional MPPs, unlike constituency MPPs, would have no specific mandate and hence no legitimacy. Not true. Under an MMP system, constituency MPs would still exist and they could deal with issues directly affecting their constituents, whereas the regional members could deal with issues affecting their region and the province, for example. They could focus on issues such as healthcare, law and order, environment, agriculture, for example. With this kind of a system, I think you can get the best of both worlds. You would still have members who could focus on the individual needs of the constituency in their communities, and you would also have members who could devote themselves to very important regional issues as well. A final myth is that MMP and other forms of proportional representation are supported primarily by left-wing parties, students, minorities, and fringe parties. Well, that is just not the case at all. I actually know of several prominent conservatives in Canada who support proportional representation of some kind. Some support MMP, others support other variants. Those individuals include Preston Manning, the founder and former leader of the Reform Party of Canada; Lincoln Alexander, a former Conservative cabinet minister and a former Ontario Lieutenant Governor; Rick Anderson, a longtime strategist of the Reform Party and the Canadian Alliance Party and a one-time advisor to Preston Manning; Patrick Boyer, a former Conservative MP, a former Conservative leadership candidate, and a known expert on electoral law and electoral reform; Janet Ecker, a former prominent Conservative cabinet minister who served in the administrations of Premier Mike Harris and Premier Ernie Eves; Hugh Segal, an Ontario Conservative senator and a one-time chief of staff to former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney; and Ted White, a former Canadian Alliance member from British Columbia. I myself, I have been a long-time supporter of the PC Party of Ontario, and I sincerely believe that we need to amend the current electoral system. The way it is now, this is not reflecting the true wishes of the voters. One of the reasons why I like MMP is, as I stated earlier, this kind of a system could act as a check and balance. The grassroots would actually select the candidates that would be placed on a regional list. And what this would do is effectively take the power out of the party leaders. And this has been a problem that's been going on. And I'll use the Liberal Party of Canada as an example. In the past, they have had past party leaders have basically overridden the wishes of their riding associations and in some cases have just parachuted candidates in, even though the riding association has gone through the bother and the trouble to elect a candidate democratically. The leader will just go and say, no, sorry, your wishes are irrelevant. I'm putting this candidate in and I have the right to as the leader. If we could have a system like MMP, that would stop such arbitrariness by a party leader. And another point I wanted to touch on, what I didn't get a chance to make in my presentation earlier, was that with an MMP system, if we had regional members, that could act as kind of a safeguard of ensuring that parties aren't exactly wiped out in an election. Like we saw